What an intro. Aaron, I'm so sorry to say, but I would believe that Courtney would know how to spell donuts before I chose you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just telling the truth, though. I also want to say I'm so proud of all of you for making it to church this morning. I saw outside. I was awake when it was snowing, and I'm just so proud of you. You all powered through. Thank you for being here. Well, we're in a sermon series on suffering, which we've called Gethsemane. It's not like the rosiest, brightest thing, but also we're leading up to Easter, so it's appropriate. So we've been camped out in the same kind of gospel accounts of Jesus' time in the Garden of Gethsemane. So when I get to the scripture, which, by the way, I'm going to read from Matthew 26, I'm just going to prep you now so you can start turning to it or scrolling to it. But we've been reading those same accounts of this scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's because we've been using the same scriptures to look at through a different lens each week. So we've talked about making sense of suffering, suffering in community, submitting to God's will, and today we get to talk about our feelings. Oh, look at that. That's not the response I was expecting, you guys. I thought you would all inwardly groan and be like, oh, we have to talk about our feelings. And if that was you, and you're like, yes, that is how I feel, I want you to know that you are in good company. Talking about my feelings is one of my least favorite things to do. Just truthfully, it is. I think people like to assume that, women like to feel lots of feelings, talk about our feelings, talk about them with our friends, cry about our feelings, all the things. I don't like any of those things, okay? All right. Thank you. Oh, Lori, I love you. I love you. In fact, my husband will often make fun of me. So he'll come home and he'll be telling me about something really hard about his day, or we'll be talking about something with the kids that's really hard, and I attempt to respond appropriately emotionally, but it's not working out, and so he sort of starts making these robot motions at me. He's like, do you have feelings? I'm not even a hugger, you guys. So I say all of that because I want you to know you're in good company, that this is work you can do, and God can do this in you, okay? I will share some of my story that God has done this in me, but you're gonna be okay. We're gonna make it through this message. So specifically, I'm gonna talk today about the importance of being transparent about our feelings in our suffering. Feelings and suffering, let's go. Okay, I already said we're gonna read Matthew 26. So it's verses 36 through 45 that I'm gonna read. Again, we've been reading these same accounts over and over. So just pay attention to things that might stand out to you differently as you hear this again. It says, then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So I'm going to talk about being honest about our feelings with ourselves, with God, and with our community. So first, being honest with ourselves. Why is it so hard to be honest with ourselves about our feelings and our suffering? Do you guys find that hard, to just be honest with yourself about your feelings? It might be because we don't know how we feel. We might not have the tools to identify our own feelings. It's vulnerable work, and being vulnerable can be really uncomfortable. The human brain is also incredible. So with the power of our own mind, we are constantly creating a narrative for ourselves about the things that are happening around us. We're analyzing how a situation went down. We're thinking about not just what we feel, but what everyone else was feeling. And we have the power to create the story in our minds. So if I have a self-protective instinct, for example, and I'm faced with a situation in which someone has hurt me, I might tell myself I'm angry when actually what I'm feeling is hurt. And when we feel hurt, we often don't want to take the time to explore that any further, because that's when we start to feel vulnerable. When we're going through something hard and when we're suffering, it's no different. Our lives might be a total mess. Like, we just feel like we are in it and we're not getting out of it. But the idea of feeling our feelings and dealing with our feelings sounds even worse. To be vulnerable means to feel uncertainty. It means taking a risk. And when we're already hurting, inviting the possibility of more hurt sounds terrible. So if we're going to talk about being honest with ourselves, with our emotions, I need to introduce you all to something called the feelings wheel. Yes. I knew you would love it, Angie. I knew it. Oh, it's so hard to see. Okay, Google it. You'll find it. It's online. This one is from the Gottman Institute, just FYI, so when you Google it, that's a good one to go to. I didn't invent this, and counselors use this all the time. I first found it in a Brene Brown book, but I'm just saying that because I think it's awesome, and I did not create this. I want you to know. But for a quick basic overview, the 6 basic emotions are in those center spokes. Maybe you can kind of see it. It says sad, mad, scared, peaceful, powerful, and joyful. And as you move out of the center of the circle, there's more emotions that are listed in 2 more rings. Brene Brown says that through her research, she's found there's something like 87 emotions. That number keeps going up every time I listen to her on a podcast or something. It's like a higher number. But most people can only identify 3. I bet you can guess which they are too. Mad, sad, and scared. Like the easiest ones. But there's 87. Some of us have a lot to learn. The Gospels are full of examples of Jesus feeling the entire range of emotions. It says in Matthew 15, he feels compassion for the crowds who are hungry before he miraculously feeds them. It says in Mark 10 that Jesus felt indignant when the disciples were keeping mothers from bringing their children to him. He was upset with their pride and their self-importance. And then when the children do come to him, he lays hands on them and blesses them. And it's loving. Loving is also on that feelings wheel. In John, it famously says that Jesus wept. He felt grief over his friend Lazarus' death. So I'm not reading all those things to tell you that there are certain emotions that are acceptable and others that are not. Like there are some that are permissible because they're in the Bible and others aren't. I'm just acknowledging that there's a huge range of emotions, and Jesus also felt them. And those things are illustrated in Scripture for us. It's slow work to take the time to identify our emotions, and that wheel is a helpful tool in creating that kind of emotional self-awareness. It's going to come back up again, don't worry. In her book, Atlas of the Heart, Brene Brown uses this great illustration to show why it's so important that we name our emotions. So she says to imagine that you have this sharp pain in your shoulder, okay, like agonizing pain. So you call the doctor and make an appointment because you want to find out what it is and what they can do about it. And then you go to the doctor, and you're in the room, and you're like sitting on the table with the paper and all that. And then just as the doctor's coming in, you realize that for some reason you're gagged. Your mouth is like duct taped, and you can't speak. And then as you're trying to process that weird reality, you realize that also your hands are tied behind your back, and you can't move them. So the doctor walks in, and you are suddenly completely incapable of telling him or her what is wrong. You can't say it, you can't point to it, you just have to sit there. And she says in that circumstance, most of us would do one of 2 things. We would either fall to the floor in despair, or we would get up and thrash around the room out of pure frustration. So if we don't learn to process and name our emotions, that is what we become. People unable to get out of our despair, laying on the floor, or people thrashing around in anger, who go about hurting ourselves and other people because of our lack of emotional awareness. We can become bitter, we can become apathetic, We get stuck and we end up in unhealthy cycles of addiction and substance abuse. We lose our ability to feel empathy towards others. And that last one is especially dangerous because that's when we start to wound other people, when we completely lack self-awareness of our emotions. So to avoid doing that, we have to learn to identify and let ourselves feel our feelings so we can become emotionally healthy. So what we're bringing to other people is health and not wounding. I told you in the beginning that I've had to put my own work into emotional self-awareness, so here's part of my story. When I was 22, I watched my dad die of cancer. I know I'm not alone in that experience. There's others of you who have probably seen loved ones die of cancer, and it is brutal. It's awful to watch. On the last night I saw him, I was at the hospital, and we knew he was dying, and so we had family coming by to say their goodbyes. And I just couldn't bring myself to leave the room. Like, I didn't really want to be there because it was really hard and it was really painful. But also, I couldn't make myself leave. And I was so emotionally exhausted. I know that people were talking to me. I know people were like trying to comfort me. I know people were trying to ask me how I was doing. And I was just not capable of making sense of my thoughts. But I did notice as I was sitting there that I had a song stuck in my head. And I need to give you permission right now to laugh when I say this, because it sounds ridiculous. You're not laughing at my pain, okay? You're allowed to join in this with me. But this was in 2005, so this song was all over the radio. Maybe you know it. It's called Holla Back Girl by Gwen Stefani. And in my head, sitting in the hospital, as my dad is dying, I had this on a loop, okay? Just this one line. And I have to edit it to be appropriate for church. But it's, this is bananas, B-A-N-A-N-A-S. This is bananas. And I remember that, like, for years after I would think about that, and I'd be like, what a weird thing. I was like, why was that in my head? But I remembered it so clearly, and it wasn't until years later that I understood that was my brain attempting to make sense of my situation, you guys. That was the best I could do to articulate what was happening. So if I had to place this is bananas on the feelings wheel, I've got a slide. That's where it would go, okay? It definitely would span mad, sad, and scared. But more specifically now, I can tell you that I was feeling things like helpless and anxious and confused, depressed, hurt, angry. It took a lot of work to get there and to be able to identify those things. But that work was worth it. I've experienced loss and grief since then, you guys, because this is life, and we all do. But now I know that in times of grief, I can just sit and be sad. I can take my time to do that. I know it doesn't last forever. But if you don't sit with your suffering and let yourself feel your feelings, you rob yourself of the opportunity to understand things like how deeply you can love. We now know, once we've sat through that the cost of love is grief, and that's okay. So I've got to get back to the scripture, but first, before I leave this part about just being honest with ourselves about our emotions, I need to name a few tools for learning to do this, and just to help you kind of create a rhythm of recognizing your own emotions. So here are some things you can do. First, give yourself permission to feel your feelings. You're allowed to feel your feelings. I think what most often stops us from doing this is shame. We start to feel, really depressed about something going on in our life, and then we think, well, there are people fleeing their homes in Ukraine. They're becoming refugees. Like, how can I feel sad about the loss of a relationship? Like, that doesn't even compare. It's not a comparison. It doesn't matter. You're allowed to feel your feelings. Andrew said this last week, and I thought it was so good. I'm going to say it again. But God recognizes our suffering. He cares because he's our creator and he loves us. He has the capacity to feel, to handle the suffering of people in Ukraine and whatever is giving you pain right here in this moment. God can handle all of that. And it still matters. It matters to God. So you have permission to feel your feelings. Give yourself that. Second, make space to feel your feelings. I loved what Mel said when she kicked off this series. She was talking about, suffering. But she said that after Simon's death, she had to schedule time into her week to feel her feelings. Like she blocked it off on her calendar and made herself sit down and feel those feelings. That is really hard. That is really vulnerable. She disciplined herself to do that because she knew it was important. So depending on what you are going through, you might have to do the same thing. You need to make space for yourself. The third thing is to write it down. We can't all be Amanda Carey, who journals every day. God bless her. I'm terrible at it. I journal like once every 10 weeks or something. But when I do it, it's so fruitful because sometimes I don't actually know how I'm feeling about something until I start writing it down. And once it's on the page, I'm shocked by what I see. I'm like, oh, that is how I'm feeling. I couldn't have named it in my mind, but once it's on the paper, there it is. That's a helpful exercise for some people. Foster relationships with people who prove themselves to be trustworthy. So this is kind of work you might have to do ahead of time, but it's really important. It's not a great idea to just open up about your deepest feelings to anyone. If you've ever had that happen to you, like, at the grocery store, someone just started pouring their heart out to you. I don't know if that's happened to you. That happens to me sometimes. It's really awkward. Like, I don't know you. I'm so sorry that you're going through things. Are you manipulating me? Like, I don't know what's happening right now. Like, you need people. You don't want to be that person. You need people in your life who you can do that with. So take the time now. If things are going great right now, perfect. It's the perfect time. Take the time now to invest in other people so that when you are suffering, you have a place to go. And then once you have those people, talk about it. Talk about your feelings and be honest about it. I've learned that for a lot of people, we can only get so far sorting through our feelings on our own. Like we might sit with our thoughts and just think, I'm gonna keep thinking on this till I work this out. I can do it. But sometimes we can't. Sometimes it takes saying it out loud to another person to really land on what it is we're feeling. We'll talk more at the end about being honest with our people, but I'll leave it there for now. And I want to say just one last thing before I leave this section. If you are trying or have tried all of these things and you still feel stuck, there is no shame in getting professional help. We are so lucky. It is a gift from God that we live in a time where mental health care is available to us, where counselors are available to us. Make use of them. People commit their careers to doing this for other people. That is a gift to us. So take advantage of that if you need to. Okay, so we talked about being honest with ourselves and our feelings. Now we're going to talk about being honest with God. If we can be honest with ourselves, then we should also be able to be honest with God about how we're feeling in our suffering. But there are so many things that can prevent us from doing that. Remember, vulnerability means feeling uncertain or even exposed. We might be afraid of offending God. What if me having a hard time with this thing makes me seem ungrateful? Is God going to be upset with me for that? We might feel like we have something to prove to God. Like if I were a really good Christian and I had really good self-control, then I wouldn't be mad about this thing. Or we might think that God might be ashamed of us because we're finding it really hard to forgive somebody for something. But I need to tell you, God isn't afraid or disappointed or put off by our pain and our suffering. We might be afraid of what God says if we share honestly. But this is the opposite of how Jesus approached it. He didn't hold back. In the passage I read earlier, it says Jesus asked God to take the suffering from him. And he said, "Take this cup from me." That is so relatable to me. What a relatable response to suffering. God, can you just make it stop? I don't want to feel this way anymore. Can you make it go away? I would say that if we were honest about feeling our pain, the suffering Jesus is not that hard to identify with. Because he suffered, we know that God can identify with us in our suffering. In verse 39, it says, Jesus fell with his face to the ground and prayed. He's on his face praying to God. That is an act of desperation. That's what you do when you have desperate things to say to God, and that is how Jesus modeled it for us. You guys probably know who Jane Marcheski is. Maybe you know her as Nightbird. She's a pretty well-known artist now. She recently lost her battle with cancer, and she passed away just last month. But during her life, she wrote with beautiful and painful honesty about her suffering. I'm sure you know something about her story. Maybe you saw her performance on America's Got Talent. It was amazing. Maybe you followed some of her Instagram posts, which are also really beautiful. But she had an aggressive cancer, and she battled it over 4 years. And she begged God to heal her, and for a time, she did experience relief. She spent time in remission. But she wrote really beautifully on her blog last spring, and she wrote that instead of feeling free in that period of time, the pain and the tragedy of everything that had happened to her caught up with her. She wasn't just diagnosed with cancer and told that she was dying, but her husband also left her. She had moved out of state to kind of try to run away from it. And all of that caught up with her, and she said she experienced it as a deep, emotional, physical pain in the form of head trauma that meant that her brain was sending signals of pain and panic all throughout her body. She said this went on for 3 months. She just stayed in her bathroom, propped against the wall, sitting on the floor, throwing up, falling asleep. She says that when she fell asleep with her head on the toilet, she felt relief, just for getting a break from the pain. So I'm going to read some of what she wrote in that blog post. She said, I fear sometimes that when I die and meet with God, that he will say that I disappointed him or offended him or failed him. Maybe he'll say that I just never learned the lesson or that I wasn't grateful enough. But one thing I know for sure is this: he can never say that he did not know me. I am God's downstairs neighbor, banging on the ceiling with a broomstick. I show up at his door every day, sometimes with songs, sometimes with curses, sometimes apologies, gifts, questions, demands. I've called him a cheat and a liar, and I meant it. I told him I wanted to die, and I meant it. I know it sounds crazy, and I can't really explain it, but God is in there even now. I've heard it said that some people can't see God because they won't look low enough, and it's true. Look lower. God is on the bathroom floor. Jane had every reason to question God. She had every reason to be angry about her situation. And she told it all to God. She didn't brush it off. She took every bit of it to the Lord. And she concluded that God was with her anyway. Even when she was angry, even when she was cynical, and especially when she was hurting. I love so much that God used her to show millions of people the beauty in a life of suffering. The beauty in a life surrendered to God. She exuded beauty in her words while describing suffering. She was brutally honest, and it became a testament to God's goodness and grace and his character to millions of people, and now that's her legacy. Her willingness to be honest with God about her pain. Only God can take our pain and turn it into blessing. In Isaiah 61, it says, God will comfort those who mourn and provide for those who grieve, bestowing on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. God is ready to hear your pain, you guys. He's not afraid of it. He's ready to give you a crown of beauty instead of ashes. So now we have to talk about how we suffer in our community. And we need to be honest with our friends about our suffering. At the same time that Jesus was pleading with and praying to God, he chose to lean on his friends. He chose that. I'm going to look again at the scripture that I read. I'm going to kind of like skip through it, but I'm just going to emphasize the parts where he's leaning on his disciples. It says, then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. Watch and pray so you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, may your will be done. And then he came back and he found them again sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went and prayed a third time. And then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Time's up. We need to be honest with our friends about our suffering, but let's acknowledge first that it's really hard to do that. And why is that? If we can be honest with ourselves, and that's hard work, and we can be honest with God, and sometimes that's hard work, why does it feel maybe even harder to be honest with other people? I think it feels like the height of vulnerability. Being vulnerable with yourself is hard, but you're just sitting with yourself and your feelings, and you can get up and go do something else at any time. It's the same thing with God. Really, only you and God know if you're being honest with God about your suffering. So you might be taking that to God in prayer, but if that starts to feel uncomfortable, you can just stop praying. You can get up and go do something else. But when you're vulnerable with another person, when you are sitting with another person and you are sharing your feelings with them, you have to speak things out loud to someone else. If you get up and walk away from that, it's even weirder. Like you're sitting there and you've got to say what you need to say. But once you say the words, they're just hanging in the air. Like that moment of hanging in the air, that's vulnerability. There's so much uncertainty and so much risk because you don't know what they're going to say. You're at the mercy of their response. We're afraid to do this because we're afraid of what might happen. They might not understand. They might be like, I don't really know what you mean by that, and you don't want to have to explain it more. They might say, that seems weird. I don't know if that's right. They might reject you. They might be like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that with you. They might respond the way the disciples did to Jesus, and that feels like we're just not getting the support we need. In verse 38, it says that Jesus tells his friends he's overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He's saying, I'm so sad I could die. My heart is so broken, I might not survive this. And then he asks them to stay with him. And what happens? They fell asleep. His pain was too much for them to carry. Jesus didn't give up, though. They had spent far too much time together already. He knew the disciples loved him, and the disciples knew he loved them. They were invested. They had spent years at this point building trust and connection. They fell asleep, but Jesus kept coming back. He had to come back and wake them up and say again, pray with me, please. I know it's hard. Just stay with me. We have to choose to be honest in order to build connection with other people. We have to make a choice to invite other people into our suffering rather than facing it alone. Because we're not meant to carry our burdens alone. We think it's an act of strength to carry our burdens on our own. But hear me say this, not even Jesus tried to do that. He asked his friends to carry his burden with him. He leaned on his people when he suffered. Do you think God is asking you to be stronger than that? He's not. James, you can make your way up if you're in here. There's a guy in our life group, Chris, who's experienced a lot of pain in the last year. His mother unexpectedly passed away last winter, but he has been so honest about his pain. He has continually asked us to help him carry his suffering. He's continued to show up, and he doesn't hesitate to talk about the pain he's experiencing. He asks for prayer when he needs it. He serves, he's hosted, he leads worship, he serves our group, and he shares honestly, even when I know that it's hard and he maybe doesn't want to. I've watched as his vulnerability within our little community, our life group, has built trust for other people. It's created space for others to share how they're hurting too. And it's challenged us to be the community that he needs. It's been an honor to walk through his suffering with him. It's an honor to know that we're so trusted. Jesus said, "Stay here and keep watch with me." Do you have people in your life that you can ask that of? And are you the kind of person that other people will ask to do that for them? God can handle our feelings, and being honest with God is exactly how we actively invite him into our suffering and later into our healing. Being honest with our community is how we invite them in. There's no greater honor than participating in someone else's suffering and getting to later see their healing. That's the beauty of living in community. So listen, at this moment in time that we are living, suffering never feels far. We could literally consume painful, scary news all day long if we wanted to. All day. We've been very aware of suffering in the last 2 years. The pandemic isolated a lot of us. We felt cut off from other people just as we needed other people the most. And we were told not to see other people, even though that's what we needed. Some of us have also gone to great lengths to avoid feeling our feelings. Maybe eating junk and watching Netflix is like your coping mechanism. Maybe drinking and watching Netflix every night is your coping mechanism. Maybe some of us have fallen back into addictions that previously we had managed because it's been hard. Maybe we've gotten into the habit of just allowing ourselves to be angry instead of acknowledging our hurt. And maybe we've directed that anger at other people who definitely didn't deserve it, whether it's in our own house or on social media. Maybe we've been putting up walls. So instead of dealing with the things that you're feeling, you found things to hide behind. And that might be politics. That might be some religious rule you've decided is what you hide behind now. You've put up walls, and it sounds like this. If you don't agree with this, keep out. If you don't believe X, unfriend me now. Maybe you stop talking to people because they keep trying to breach those walls. Where are places that we might be pushing people away or isolating ourselves? And if you've considered that those things maybe aren't from the Lord, if you feel some unease about that, why are you holding on to them? I'm going to invite some people forward for prayer this morning. So let's all stand up. I know this series has been really hard. I do want to say, if you are suffering and going through something really hard, then I hope this has felt like a gift to you. That we've just been talking about this openly for the last 3 or 4 weeks or whatever. I mean, that's an easy and open invitation. Just come forward and get prayer, okay? So if you're just suffering, if you've got something going on, some kind of illness, maybe a loved one has an illness and you want to pray about that, like, you can just go ahead and come forward. We'll pray for that. But I also want to say that you might need people in your life to share in your suffering. And I want to offer you just a really practical thing before we close. And that is joining a life group. If you have the app on your phone, you can scroll through. You can see all the life groups and where they're meeting in the city. And you can just show up to any of them. Maybe you're in a really good place and you're like, oh, I'm fine, it's fine. Like, great, that's a great time to join a life group. Because things will at some point in time get hard and you need people. We already talked about that. But even if right now you're like, I am the hot mess express, right? Like my life is falling apart. I know no one wants to show up to a group of new people when you are feeling that way. Like I don't know, that's really hard. You don't want to show up and be the person who's already kind of a mess. But guess what? Like we're already meeting. We already have people who are hurting. Like you can just come in. I promise you that we will make space for you. So do that. Before you leave this building, if you need that, pull it up on the app. Go out in the lobby. There's a wall that has pictures of people and life groups. Like, pull one of those down. You might need to admit that it isn't strength that's holding you back from sharing your feelings with others. It's fear. Come and get prayer if that's you. Actually, can I get some of the prayer team to just come forward and be up here? Thanks. I see you, Jeff. I don't know if we need more people, but I just want to say people are going to come get prayer if there's people standing up here. So if you can pray for people, come on up. I think there are people here who need to know that it's time to do the work of being honest with yourself about your feelings. Holding that tight and locking that away somewhere in your brain has not done you any favors. You might be aware even that you've hurt other people because of your own lack of emotional awareness. Come and get prayer. That's not like a thing I'm just saying. Like, come get prayer if you need prayer. Lastly, this is a hard one, but it might be time for you to be honest with God about your feelings. There's a roadblock that's kept you from fully submitting to the Lord, and that roadblock is the truth that you don't trust him. You don't know how he's going to respond if you're really honest about your feelings, and you're afraid of that too. Maybe you're afraid to feel shame or feel rejected, but I would say that maybe you haven't considered that you might just feel his love. I would love to pray for you if that's you. Well, come forward and get prayer if you want. James is going to play for a little bit longer. But the rest of you can be dismissed. We're done for today. But please don't leave here if any of those things really touch something in you. We would love to pray with you. Grace and peace over all of you.